You're not a bad kid. You're just small. You dream too big for pockets that empty. You'll never be enough for my daughter. And one day, you'll thank me.
They say love doesn't care about status, but in the world of the wealthy, love often has to fight for air. And on one unforgettable night, a simple dinner in a glass mansion would test just how deep a man's heart could go, and how blind power could become. It started with laughter, echoing through marble halls and crystal chandeliers. The Hamilton family's long dining table shimmered under gold light. Silver cutlery lined up like soldiers. At the head sat Richard Hamilton, billionaire, self-made titan of finance, known for his empire as much as his pride. Beside him, his daughter Emily, the only person who ever made him smile without effort. She was 23, gentle, brilliant, and hopelessly in love with a boy her father could never understand. Jake was nothing like them. No tailored suit, no last name that opened doors, just a black hoodie, a nervous smile, and a heart that believed love was enough. He sat at that table, surrounded by million-dollar paintings, trying to make himself smaller with every breath. The scent of roasted lamb filled the air, but he could barely swallow. Every set of eyes, from Richard's business partners to the silent butlers, was on him. Emily reached for his hand under the table. A quiet promise. But her father noticed, and that was all it took. The laughter stopped. The air froze. Richard set down his wine glass with a heavy sound that seemed to echo forever. He leaned forward, his voice calm, but sharp enough to cut through Jake's chest. He asked Jake where he saw himself in 5 years. Jake said softly, "Building something of my own." Richard's smile vanished. The words that followed would change everything. He told Jake that ambition without money was just a dream, and dreams didn't feed daughters. He told him that love was a luxury poor men couldn't afford. And then, in front of everyone, he said what he truly believed, that Jake would never be enough for his daughter. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Jake's heart sank, but he didn't argue. He stood up, shaking slightly, thanked them for dinner, and walked out into the cold night. Behind him, laughter slowly returned. Awkward, forced, the kind that covers guilt with noise. But Emily didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the door he walked through. That night, Jake sat in his tiny one-room apartment, staring at his reflection in a cracked mirror. The same words echoed again and again. "You're too poor for my daughter." He whispered to himself that one day he'd prove that money doesn't make a man. But as he looked around, bare walls, empty plates, a single flickering bulb, it felt like the whole world agreed with Richard Hamilton. Still, something inside him refused to die. He opened his laptop, the one he'd built from spare parts years ago. He started typing. Lines of code filled the screen like lifelines. Each keystroke carried a heartbeat, each failure a bruise. For hours he worked, building, testing, breaking, and building again. When dawn came, he hadn't slept, but in that exhaustion, he felt alive. Days turned into weeks. Jake ate instant ramen for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He sold his old guitar for an extra month of internet. He coded through headaches, learned through rejection, and kept a notebook where he wrote down every no he received from investors. There were 38 of them. 38 times someone told him he wasn't ready. 38 times he wanted to give up, but didn't. Every night he remembered Emily's face at that dinner table, the way she looked at him, like he mattered. That memory became his fuel. Not revenge, not pride, just quiet determination to become someone who could protect the people he loved. Meanwhile, at the mansion, life went on. Emily tried to forget, but love doesn't fade under chandeliers. It hides, waiting. Her father noticed the silence in her laughter, the way her eyes lost their light. They told himself it was for the best. He believed he had saved her from a lifetime of struggle. But sometimes, the things we do to protect end up being the things that destroy. 6 months later, the Hamilton empire was thriving, or so it seemed. Behind the polished headlines and glowing reports, cracks were forming. A new player had entered the market, a quiet startup making waves in digital security. Nobody knew its founder, Nobody saw his face, but everyone in the industry was talking about the mysterious coder who built an AI so advanced it was rewriting how data was protected. The company's name was Novatech, and in a dim garage with wires hanging from the ceiling, that coder smiled quietly at the glowing screen that showed the company's growth. Jake had done it. He watched the numbers rise, the contracts roll in, the small investments multiply into millions. Crypto markets surged, and his algorithms predicted every move. What started as survival became dominance. He hired a team of 3, then 30, then hundreds, all remotely, all believing in the same vision. He didn't show his face in interviews. He let the work speak, and soon the work spoke louder than any name could. One evening, as rain hit the metal roof of his garage, Jake received an email. It was from a private equity firm looking to acquire his company. Polisaki opened the proposal. The offer was high, too high, and the name on the document made his hands go still. Hamilton Global Holdings. Richard Hamilton's empire. Emily's father's company. He sat there for a long time staring at the name. The man who once told him he had nothing was now trying to buy what he'd built. He could have laughed. He could have said no. But instead he felt something else, a strange mix of sadness and resolve. He replied with one line, "Let's talk." The next morning, in a sleek glass office overlooking the city, Richard Hamilton sat across from his executives. The company's profits had dipped. Their cybersecurity division was collapsing. He told them not to worry, that he'd found a solution, a small tech startup with the software they needed. No one questioned him. Richard always had a plan. He said they'd buy Novatech within the week. What he didn't know was that Novatech had already made its move. Jake had quietly acquired controlling shares of Hamilton Global through a chain of crypto transactions, routing through shell firms that no one could trace back to him. By dawn, the empire that once humiliated him was already his. But Jake didn't announce it. Not yet. He wanted to walk into that boardroom the same way he'd walked out of that mansion. Quiet, calm, and underestimated. For the next 3 days, the business world buzzed with rumors. Some said Hamilton Global was being bought out. Others said it was collapsing. The truth was stranger. The buyer wasn't a competitor or a billionaire. It was the same boy Richard had laughed at, a boy who refused to give up. Jake arrived at the Hamilton headquarters early that morning. He wore the same hoodie, the same jeans, but his posture was different now. Steady, calm, the kind that comes from surviving storms. The receptionist didn't recognize him. The guards didn't question him. He walked past the marble walls lined with awards and photographs of Richard, shaking hands with presidents and CEOs. Every photo looked like a monument to ego. But today, that ego was about to meet humility. Inside the boardroom, the directors were seated, waiting for the new investor. Richard walked in, confident, adjusting his cufflinks, ready to charm whoever this mysterious buyer was. Then the doors opened, and Jake stepped in. The silence that followed was heavy. Richard's smile faltered. His eyes narrowed, not believing what he was seeing. Jake greeted everyone calmly, placed a folder on the table, and said, "Good morning." He didn't need to say more. The logo on the folder said everything. Novatech. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Richard spoke, his voice sharp with disbelief. He asked what Jake was doing there. Jake replied quietly that he was there to finalize the merger. Richard laughed, the same way he had that night at dinner. But this time, the room didn't laugh with him. The lawyers began to whisper. The board members shifted uneasily. One of them opened the documents, checked the signatures, and looked up in shock. The company had already changed ownership. Jake was no longer the poor boy from the dinner table. He was the new owner of Hamilton Global Holdings. Richard's face went pale. He looked at Jake, searching for anger, revenge, pride, anything. But Jake's eyes were calm. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted peace. He told the board they would keep every employee. No layoffs, no firings. He told them he wasn't here to destroy the company, but to rebuild it. And then he turned to Richard, the man who once called him unworthy, and said softly, "You built this once. I believe you can help me build it again." The room was silent. Even the city outside seemed to pause. Richard didn't respond. His jaw tightened, his eyes lowered, his pride fighting for air. He stood up, trying to walk out, but his steps were heavy. He knew he wasn't walking away from a deal. He was walking away from the illusion of control. When Jake left the room that day, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt something deeper, like he'd closed a circle. The boy who had walked out humiliated was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned that success means nothing if it's built from bitterness. That night, Jake went home to his same old garage, sat in front of his computer, and watched the news quietly report. Novatech acquires Hamilton Global Holdings in $2.4 billion deal. He closed the laptop. The same flickering bulb still hung overhead, but somehow the room didn't feel small anymore. The following morning began like any other, but something in the air around the Hamilton mansion felt heavier. The staff whispered as they polished marble floors. The newspaper on the front steps carried headlines Richard couldn't escape. Every screen, every business channel, every site, his name beside Jake's company, the deal, the figure that made jaws drop across Wall Street. $2.4 billion. That was the price of his pride. But the money wasn't what stung. It was the fact that the boy he once dismissed had not only built an empire, but had done so silently, without fanfare, without revenge. That silence was the loudest humiliation of all. Richard sat alone in his study, surrounded by leather and glass and portraits of himself shaking hands with men he once admired. The news anchor's voice filled the room saying, "The young entrepreneur behind Novatech, identity still unconfirmed, has completed one of the fastest private acquisitions in modern history." He muted the television, exhaled deeply, and for the first time in years, didn't feel powerful. Upstairs, Emily stood at her balcony, watching the sunrise filter through mist. She hadn't spoken to Jake since that night. Her heart had stayed in pause, somewhere between memory and hope. She didn't know he was Novatech's founder. She didn't know the man her father ruined was now rewriting their lives. She just knew something about the world felt different, and that maybe, just maybe, her heart had been right all along. That day, Richard drove to the company headquarters himself. No chauffeur, no assistant. The city looked colder through the tinted glass of his car. Every billboard that once carried Hamilton Global's proud blue logo now displayed a simple white one. Novatech. Minimal, modern, quietly dominant. Each sign was like a mirror showing him how far behind he'd fallen. When he reached the lobby, the receptionist greeted him with polite hesitation. She'd already seen the memo. Leadership restructure, new ownership, new chairman. Richard gave a faint nod, stepped into the elevator, and rode up in silence. The reflection in the elevator doors showed a man who looked older than he remembered, eyes tired, hands uncertain. At the top floor, the doors opened to a boardroom that no longer felt like his. Jake stood by the window, looking out at the skyline. He didn't turn when Richard entered. He just said, "I thought you'd come." His tone was calm, not sharp, not triumphant, just steady. Richard walked closer, each step echoing like footsteps in memory. He stopped beside the table where, years ago, he'd made decisions that shaped industries. Now he couldn't even find words. He wanted to say something cold, something that would remind him he was still in control. But the truth had already stripped that armor away. Finally, he spoke. He asked Jake if this was revenge. Jake smiled faintly, still facing the window. He said it wasn't. He said he didn't want to destroy him, just to prove that worth isn't measured in wealth, but in will. That line hit harder than any insult could. Richard sat down slowly, as though the air itself weighed him down. He whispered, almost to himself, that he didn't recognize the man standing before him. Jake turned then, meeting his eyes for the first time. He said quietly, "I'm the same man you met at dinner. You just never looked long enough to see me." Silence filled the room. Not anger, not resentment, just realization. Richard nodded slightly, looked away, and said he was proud of what Jake built, even if it hurt to admit it. He asked what Jake planned to do with the company. Jake replied that he planned to rebuild it, stronger, fairer, with transparency and innovation. He said there would be no layoffs, no corporate games, only growth and redemption. Richard didn't expect that. He'd prepared for war, not grace, and that made the defeat cut deeper. He stood again, buttoned his jacket, and said he'd leave quietly. But before he could go, Jake said one more thing. He told him he didn't want him to leave. He wanted him to stay and help lead. Richard froze. He asked why. Jake said because every empire needs its architect. Because even the proud deserve second chances if they're willing to see the world differently. For a long moment, Richard couldn't speak. His throat tightened. His hands trembled. Then, without meaning to, he sat back down and covered his face. He didn't cry, not yet, but something inside him broke open, something old and heavy. Years of arrogance collapsed into a single truth. The boy he once rejected had become the man he wished he'd been. Later that night, the news spread faster than anyone could predict. Former CEO Richard Hamilton appointed as strategic director under new ownership. Social media exploded. Commentators debated whether it was a power move or an act of forgiveness. But those who knew Jake's story, the sleepless nights, the rejections, the ramen, and the loneliness, understood it was something rarer. Mercy in the language of success. In the days that followed, the company transformed. The old glass walls of Hamilton Global became filled with life again. Younger minds joined, eager to build something meaningful. The culture shifted from fear to vision. And at the heart of it all, Jake worked quietly, avoiding the spotlight. He refused interviews, declined magazine covers, ignored awards. His only goal was to build something that would outlive ego. But behind every calm man lies a storm of memory. At night, when the offices were dark and the city lights glowed beneath him, he'd sometimes replay that dinner in his mind. The way Richard's words cut through laughter, the way Emily's hand trembled beneath the table, the way he'd walked out, feeling smaller than air. Now, even after all his victories, that night remained like a scar. It didn't hurt anymore, but it never disappeared. One Friday evening, 6 months after the takeover, Richard knocked on his office door. He looked different now, no longer the iron-willed tycoon, but a man who'd found something humbler in himself. He asked Jake for a few minutes. James nodded. Richard said he'd been reviewing old security footage from the house, archived from the night of the dinner. He'd watched it again and again, watching himself speak those words, seeing Emily's face, seeing Jake's silence. He said it broke him. He said he wanted to show Jake something. He handed him a flash drive. Jake hesitated but took it. Later that night, in the quiet of his home office, Jake plugged it into his laptop. The screen flickered, and grainy footage filled it, dated 6 months earlier. The Hamilton dining room. The dinner that changed everything. He watched as the scene replayed, the laughter, the wine, the humiliation. He watched himself stand up, walk out, the way Emily's hand reached halfway across the table before falling still. Then the angle shifted. Another camera, one he hadn't known existed, showing the driveway, showing him walking away under the rain, shoulders hunched, hands deep in his pockets. He sat there watching in silence. And for the first time, he saw it from outside himself, the moment that birthed everything, the moment that turned a boy into a builder. Tears blurred the screen, not for the pain, but for how far it had brought him. Then, without warning, another clip began to play. It wasn't from that night. It was from the months after. Richard had installed new cameras in his office. The footage showed him late at night, alone, staring at an empty glass, whispering something no one was meant to hear. Jake turned up the volume. Richard's voice, raw and quiet, said, "Maybe I was wrong. Maybe love deserves a chance I never gave it." Jake leaned back, wiping his eyes. The man he once hated was already paying a price Jake could never demand. Guilt had already done its work. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. The hum of the computer was the only sound. In that silence, he understood something. Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's freedom. The next morning, Jake called Richard to meet him at the old mansion. When Richard arrived, the same dinner table stood where it always had. But this time there were only 2 chairs. No guests, no laughter, just truth waiting to be spoken. They sat across from each other, the air thick with memories. Jake began first. He told him he saw the footage, that he knew what it meant. He said he wasn't angry anymore. He said the only thing that mattered now was peace. And Emily. At her name, Richard looked down, guilt washing over him again. He said she still asked about Jake sometimes, though he always changed the subject. He said she never moved on. Jake smiled faintly. He said maybe it was time for her to know the truth. Richard nodded slowly, eyes shining. He asked if Jake still loved her. Jake didn't answer with words. He just looked toward the garden outside, the same one where he and Emily once sat, dreaming of a future everyone said was impossible. That silence was enough. Richard stood, moved around the table, and did something Jake never expected. He knelt. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. Just quiet surrender. He said, "I was wrong about you, about everything. If you still love her, take her hand. Take my blessing. And if you'll let me work for you, not above you." Jake reached out, helping him up. He said softly, "No one works for me, Richard. We build together." For the first time, they smiled at the same moment. 2 men from different worlds finally meeting in the middle. Outside, Emily stepped into the sunlight. She had arrived quietly, unnoticed, hearing only the end of their words. Her eyes widened, her heart catching in her throat. Jake turned, saw her, and for a second, time froze. The months apart, the pain, the silence, it all fell away. And in that fragile, wordless moment, the world made sense again. For a moment, the world stood still. Emily's eyes met Jake's, and in that single glance, months of silence shattered. No words could hold the weight of what they felt. Every sleepless night, every message never sent, every memory replayed alone, all of it was right there, between them. She took a hesitant step forward. He didn't move. It was as if they were afraid that one wrong motion would wake them from a dream. The air around them was soft, the kind that makes the heart remember what forgiveness feels like. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. She said she had waited for him, even when she didn't know if waiting made sense anymore. Jake didn't answer right away. He just looked at her like someone seeing home after years of wandering. Then he said quietly that he never stopped building, not for revenge, not for pride, but for her. She smiled through tears, the kind that glow in sunlight. Behind them, Richard watched from the terrace, hands clasped, heart heavy but full. For the first time, he saw what love really looked like. Not wealth, not control, not power, but 2 souls who refused to give up on each other, even when the world did. The 3 of them stood in silence as the afternoon light poured across the marble floor. And for the first time since that fateful dinner, there was peace in that house. Later that evening, Jake sat in the garden alone. The fountain trickled softly beside him. The air smelled of rain and jasmine. He thought about the strange path that had brought him here, from ramen noodles and broken code to billion-dollar boardrooms and redemption. And in all that noise of success, one thought echoed the loudest. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't winning, it's forgiving. Emily joined him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one and sat beside him. They didn't talk about the past. They just listened, to the wind, to the soft hum of a life rebuilt. Finally, she asked if he ever hated her father. Jake shook his head. He said he hated the way it felt to be invisible, but never the man himself. Because if Richard hadn't humiliated him, he might never have found the strength to become who he was meant to be. Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, whispering that he'd always been that man. He just had to see it for himself. The next few months unfolded like a second sunrise. Jake worked closely with Richard at the company, not as a superior but as a partner. They rebuilt trust one decision at a time. Richard's old rigidity softened. He started mentoring the young engineers Jake hired, teaching them not about money, but about mistakes. Sometimes Jake would catch him staring at a photograph of his late wife, the woman who had taught Emily to see the good in everyone. Richard once told Jake she would have liked him. That single sentence meant more than any apology could. Under their leadership, the company flourished. Hamilton Global became Novatech Hamilton, a symbol of innovation and integrity. Every major publication tried to tell the story, how a garage coder became a billionaire, how the arrogant father bowed to his daughter's choice, how love rewrote the language of success. But Jake avoided the cameras. He always said the real story wasn't about wealth, it was about worth. Behind closed doors, though, the journey wasn't without scars. Jake still struggled with the memory of failure, the taste of rejection, the sleeplessness, the loneliness of those 6 months when no one believed in him. Some nights, he'd stay late at the office, walking through empty corridors, replaying everything. He wasn't haunted by revenge anymore, but by gratitude. He knew how close he came to giving up. One evening, Richard found him there, still in his hoodie, coding like old times. He stood by the door and said, half smiling, "Some habits die hard." Jake chuckled and replied, "The hoodie stays. It reminds me where I came from." Richard nodded, then said softly, "Keep it. The world needs to remember that success can wear simplicity." It was strange how their relationship had changed. Two men who once stood on opposite sides of pride now stood side by side, humbled by life. Weeks later, the company prepared for its annual shareholders' gala. It was the first event under new leadership, and the press was waiting for their first joint appearance. Emily helped Jake with his tie, teasing him that the world might finally see the man she always believed in. He smiled, nervous as ever, saying he still preferred hoodies to suits. She told him it didn't matter what he wore. He was the reason hope had a face. That night, the ballroom was filled with light. Journalists, executives, investors, all gathered to see the man who had bought an empire with code and courage. Jake stepped up to the podium, took a breath, and looked around. He spoke not about profits or strategy, but about people, about second chances, about humility, about how the world changes when someone chooses kindness over revenge. The room fell silent. Every word felt heavier than gold. When he finished, there was a moment of stillness before the applause erupted. Richard stood near the back, clapping slowly at first, then proudly. When he looked over at Emily, who was wiping tears, and whispered to himself that maybe this was what legacy truly meant. Not buildings or wealth, but the ability to leave the world a little softer than you found it. After the gala, Jake slipped outside to the balcony to breathe. The city lights stretched endlessly below, the hum of traffic like a lullaby. Emily joined him again, leaning on the railing. He asked her quietly if she ever thought about that night, the dinner, the humiliation, the heartbreak. She said she did, but not with pain anymore. She said it reminded her that some storms exist only to clear the path ahead. Jake smiled, staring at the skyline. He said, "Your father taught me that love can break you before it builds you." She replied, "And you taught him that forgiveness can build more than money ever could." The wind carried their laughter through the night. For once, life didn't feel like a battle. It felt like belonging. Months turned into a year. Novatech Hamilton became one of the fastest growing firms in the world. But with success came new tests, offers, politics, endless meetings. Jake handled them quietly, always remembering why he started. He invested in programs for underprivileged youth, creating scholarships for young coders who couldn't afford university. He visited schools, talked to students about failure, about resilience, about how greatness starts with small beginnings. Everywhere he went, he told them the same thing. Never judge a hoodie without seeing the empire inside it. That line spread like wildfire online. People printed it on posters, shirts, digital walls. It became more than a quote. It became a reminder that dreams don't wear designer suits. Emily watched him build not just a company, but a movement. Sometimes she'd tease him, calling him the world's humblest billionaire. He'd laugh and say, "That's because I know how it feels to be invisible." Richard's health began to fade slowly with time. He'd worked for decades, lived on adrenaline and ambition. Now he spent more time at home, in the same study where his empire once began. Jake visited him often. They'd sit for hours, not talking about business, but about life, about mistakes and miracles. One afternoon, Richard looked out the window at the garden and said, "I spent half my life building walls around my heart. You tore them down without trying." Jake didn't know what to say. He just nodded, humbled. When Richard passed quietly in his sleep a year later, the world mourned a tycoon. But Jake mourned something else, a mentor who became a father. At the funeral, the crowd was enormous. Reporters, friends, employees, all there to honor him. Jake stood beside Emily, holding her hand, watching the man who once hated him, now remembered with love. He delivered a eulogy, not as a businessman, but as a son. He said Richard taught him that even broken men can choose redemption, and that forgiveness isn't the end of a story, it's the start of a better one. As he spoke, Emily squeezed his hand tighter, tears streaming freely. Every word felt like closure, every silence like healing. After the service, Jake walked alone through the garden where it had all begun, the same place he once stood humiliated, now filled with peace. He led up at the mansion, the setting sun glinting off its windows, and whispered a quiet thank you. To life, to struggle, to the man who had unknowingly built his destiny. He knew then that success wasn't owning the company. It was owning himself, his heart, his humility, his humanity. And somewhere between the whispers of leaves and the fading light, he felt a presence, a memory of Richard's voice saying, "Take care of her." Jake smiled, knowing he would. Emily stepped out from behind the trees, walking toward him in her black dress, eyes still red from crying. He reached for her hand, and together they stood there as the sky turned gold. Sometimes love doesn't conquer all at once. Sometimes it rebuilds piece by piece, until the scars become stories, and the stories become hope. And for Jake and Emily, hope was enough. After the funeral, life didn't rush back to normal. It softened. The mansion that once echoed with power now carried a gentler quiet, like even the walls were learning to breathe again. Emily spent her mornings tending the garden her mother planted. Jake spent his evenings walking the halls where ambition once shouted and now whispered peace. The company ran smoother than ever. People worked not out of fear but out of faith. The culture had changed. The energy felt alive. Yet despite all of it, Jake carried one weight he hadn't shared. There was something he'd hidden all along, something no one, not even Emily, knew. In a small locked drawer in his office sat a hard drive labeled Proof. Inside was 6 months of footage, not from security cameras, but from a small webcam he had used to document his journey. Every failure, every sleepless night, every no that turned into fuel. He never meant to show it to anyone. It wasn't pride, it was pain. But after Richard's passing, he realized the world needed to see the truth. One morning, he called his media team. He said he wanted to produce something different, something raw, something real. No corporate polish, just honesty. And so, over the next few weeks, they compiled every clip, grainy shots of his garage, ramen cups stacked on the floor, nights where his eyes were red and his hands shook from exhaustion. The footage showed the boy behind the billionaire, the human behind the empire. They added timestamps, 2:14 a.m., 3:42 a.m., 5:09 a.m. They showed him falling asleep at his keyboard, waking up to error messages, whispering to himself, "I can't stop now." Then came the moment everything changed, the night the crypto spike hit, when his algorithms finally cracked the code that turned survival into fortune. He didn't celebrate. He just sat there, staring at the screen in disbelief, tears mixing with sweat. He whispered, "Maybe this is it." The montage stretched on for minutes, his life condensed into flashes of struggle and persistence. The music built softly under his voice as he narrated. "I wasn't born into power. I was built by rejection. I wasn't lucky. I was desperate enough to try one more time when everything told me to quit. The video ended with a single line in white on black. Never judge a hoodie without seeing the empire inside it. When the footage premiered internally, the entire company gathered in the auditorium. No one moved. No one breathed. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. People stood silently, applauding not the success, but the truth. Emily watched from the front row, tears rolling freely. She had known he was strong, but she had never seen what strength cost him. When the lights came back on, she walked up to him, touched his cheek and whispered, "You didn't just build a company, you built faith in people again." The video spread beyond their walls. Within a week, it went viral. Millions watched it across platforms, calling it the billionaire who forgave. Comments flooded in, people sharing their own struggles, their own nights of doubt. For the first time, the internet wasn't arguing, it was feeling. Reporters called him a symbol of humility. Business schools played the montage during lectures. But Jake stayed quiet, avoiding interviews. He said it wasn't about fame, it was about reflection. At home, life was simple. He and Emily moved into a smaller house by the coast, a place where ocean waves replaced city noise. He spent mornings writing, evenings walking with her barefoot in the sand, nights talking about how strange and beautiful life could be when you let go of bitterness. Every once in a while, they'd return to the mansion for meetings or family gatherings. Every visit reminded him of how far they'd come. Where there was once pride, now there was peace. Where there was once silence, laughter filled the air. One evening, as the sun sank low over the garden, Emily found Jake sitting by the fountain again, laptop open, replaying the footage of his journey. She sat beside him and asked why he still watched it. He smiled faintly and said, "Because I never want to forget the version of me who refused to quit." She leaned her head on his shoulder, whispering, "That version made you who you are." Time passed quietly. The company thrived, their lives intertwined deeper each day. But one morning, Emily woke to find Jake already gone from bed. She followed the faint hum of sound down the hall to his office. He was watching something new, CCTV footage Richard had left behind. She stood at the door, listening as he whispered softly, "I never knew he saved this." On the screen was Richard, late nights in his study, eyes tired, voice recording messages never sent. In one, he said, "If Jake ever sees this, tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I see now that wealth without wisdom is emptiness, and tell my daughter that her love saved me." Emily covered her mouth, sobbing quietly. Jake reached out, took her hand and said, "He already told us in his own way." They sat there until sunrise, watching the man who once stood above them now speak from the humblest place. A father who learned too late that love was the real inheritance. That day, Jake decided to honor him one last time. He organized a scholarship in Richard's name, the Hamilton Fellowship, for students who came from nothing but carried dreams that scared them. He told the board the goal wasn't to produce more billionaires, it was to produce more believers. Within months, thousands applied. Some wrote that they'd grown up watching his story. Others said they'd lost everything and were trying to rebuild. Jake read every letter. Some made him cry, others made him smile. But each one reminded him why he had built Novatech in the first place. On the anniversary of Richard's passing, they held a memorial at the mansion. Old employees, new students, journalists, all gathered again under the same chandelier that once witnessed humiliation. Jake stepped up to speak. He didn't talk about technology or money. He talked about change, about how even the hardest hearts can turn soft when they remember what it means to love. He said, "I once walked out of this house feeling small. Today, I walk in remembering that humility is not weakness, it's strength with grace." The crowd rose in silence, a standing ovation that felt less like applause and more like gratitude. After the event, Emily found him alone again at the fountain. She sat beside him, the reflection of lights dancing on the water. He said quietly, "Do you think your father would be proud?" She smiled, whispering, "He already was. He just didn't know how to show it." The night grew quiet, and for a long moment, they just listened to the wind. Then Jake said softly, "It's strange, isn't it? The same man who broke me became the reason I built everything." Emily nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Sometimes God writes stories even pride can't erase. They sat there hand in hand until the stars came out, two survivors of love's cruelest test, finally resting in the peace they earned. Years later, Jake's name became legend in business schools, not for his fortune, but for his forgiveness. His video was archived in museums as one of the most watched motivational stories of its time. Yet when asked about it, he always said the same thing. It wasn't motivation, it was confession. He never remarried wealth, he married kindness. And in every boardroom speech, every interview he finally accepted, he ended with the same words. Word 37 that had defined his journey, his pain, and his purpose. Never judge a hoodie without seeing the empire inside it. The camera faded on his quiet smile, the sound of waves in the distance. Then a single image, him walking away from the mansion hand in hand with Emily, filled the screen. No luxury, no arrogance, just peace. And as the credits rolled, one last line lingered, bright against the dark. Because sometimes, the poorest boy in the room is the richest soul in the story.